Today, I'd like to share some of my research with everyone on this little video in a talk I'm calling Jesus Inclusive Classroom, How Jesus Authentic Teaching Material Catered to Women. And this is research from my book, Gender in the Rhetoric of Jesus, which was published by Fortress Lexington in 2019. And before I share the findings or the contents of this book, I'm going to step back in time and talk about what started the questions that I asked for this book. And what started the questions, I will tell two stories from the Gospels in order to illustrate why this book came to be. And the two stories are very well known, at least among Christians, the story of Jesus and the woman at the well, or Jesus and the Samaritan woman, and the story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery, both found in the Gospel of John. The story of Jesus and the woman at the well is a conversation that happens between Jesus and a Samaritan woman at a well when Jesus' disciples have gone off to buy lunch and he's alone with this woman, and they end up having a witty repartee and that gets a little bit risque and culminates in her starting to think, wait a minute, is this the Messiah I'm talking to? And the big reveal in John's gospel is he says to her, I am he. And she's kind of the first one that he's come out and said, I am the Messiah. And she goes and tells the rest of the Samaritan people. And the second story I'm going to tell that sets up why I wrote this book is one of my favorite stories about Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. And in this story, you've probably heard the saying, even if you don't know the Bible or the New Testament, he who is without sin cast the first stone. Let the one who has no sin throw the first stone. It's from this amazing story where a group of kind of religious elites drag in a woman who has been caught in the act of adultery, and they say, we're going to stone her, which, by the way, was totally legal, particularly since the time of Caesar Augustus. So the very early Roman Empire, Augustus did a bunch of so-called moral reforms or marital reforms. And one of the laws he put in place was that it was absolutely legal for a man to kill his wife, no questions asked, no trial, not illegal. If he suspected her of adultery, he could go ahead and murder her. And so this story is from that time. These people happen to be Jewish, and they're going to stone the woman to death. And Jesus says, oh, great, a stoning. Okay, there's only one rule. Whoever is perfect and never sinned, go ahead and get the ball rolling and throw that first stone. Come on, guys, let's kill her. And then slowly, one by one, beginning with the elders, every single person in that group sheepishly left. And the implication of the story is they were not perfect. So why were they judging her for a sin when they also all had sins? And then Jesus says, no one has condemned you. Well, I guess you're free to go. Don't sin anymore. And so I love both of these stories for different reasons, but both of these stories have a few things in common. One is that they're frequently used by Christian theologians, feminist theologians, priests and pastors to draw out something about what we can learn about the relationship between Jesus and women, these conversations between Jesus and women. And that is normal. That's a normal thing for practitioners of a religion to do with their holy scriptures, draw out lessons and learn what we can. But the second thing that both of these stories have in common is that from the perspective of a historian, these aren't historical stories. These didn't happen, and Jesus didn't say these things. That's Christians who have sort of a view of the Bible, like biblical inerrancy, which became popular in more recent centuries, kind of a biblical literalism. This conclusion isn't comfortable for them, but I mean, many historians look to the biblical text the same way they look to other ancient texts, and using the typical methods of history, they learn that these two stories probably didn't originate from Jesus. The woman and the well story, one of the main reasons is it's a trope. It's a formula. It's a popular story formula that was well known. Guy meets girl at well, and then they're supposed to get married, but this one has a twist, so it's subverting the trope. And it tells us more about what the author of John's Gospel wanted to say about Samaritans than it tells us about a real conversation that Jesus had. And that the woman caught in adultery, I wish this were Jesus. And it's believable that it's a sentiment that Jesus would have shared. But the manuscript evidence for this pericope or passage only pops into the Gospel of John quite late, so maybe 4th century. And when it does pop in, it comes in different places in the manuscripts. So what that tells us is the earliest evidence we have for this is hundreds of years after Jesus and not before. So it's not in the original manuscripts of John. And so for all kinds of reasons, those two passages are not thought by simple historians to tell us anything about the historical Jesus. But I am a historian of the historical Jesus and a historian of gender. So I want to know about Jesus of Nazareth, relationships with women, views on gender, interactions with women. I want to know about that. So how can I discover that? Well, a basic rule of thumb for a historical method is whatever you're looking for, sort out your evidence in chronological order. It's not 100%, like it's not a science that what came closer in time and geography to the thing that you're looking at is going to be better evidence, but it's a good starting point. So when we lay out all the material that we have about Jesus of Nazareth that's from the 1st or early 2nd century in chronological order, what do we get? Well, the oldest stuff we have is the letters of Paul, the genuine, undisputed letters of Paul. What do they tell us about Jesus of Nazareth? Pretty much nothing, because Paul never personally met Jesus. He kind of joined up afterwards, and he cares a lot about the meaning of the Christ, but he doesn't show much evidence of knowing about the life of Jesus of Nazareth. All we can learn from Paul about Jesus and women is that around Paul were already, before he joined, clearly a lot of women who were prominent in the movement, substantial patrons, financial backers, different kinds of teachers and leaders. So Paul inherited a movement from the early Jesus movement that was filled with lots of women, but that's one hint about the women around Jesus and the Jesus movement. But what else do we have that might go right back to Jesus? Well, we have the Gospels, the 4 Gospels that made it into the New Testament. As we all probably know, those are later. Those begin at around the year 70 and stretch all the way to maybe 120. So they're decades, wherever you date them, they're decades after that, after Paul. But that doesn't mean, just because they came later, it doesn't mean that the material in them doesn't go back to Jesus. But how do we figure out what does? We have to use different methods of history. And one of the bodies of material that historians have identified as more likely to go right back to Jesus, more or less, in the form we have them, is the sayings, the teachings, the parables and stories of Jesus that are found both in Matthew and in Luke. Or some people call that the Q material. Q, it can mean a lot of things, but in this case, it stands for Quelle, the German word for source. And it refers to a body of quotes from Jesus, stories, jokes, one-off sayings, quips, parables, teachings ostensibly from the mouth of Jesus. And the reason we call it Q is because of something known as the two-source hypothesis. Everything in New Testament studies is a hypothesis, and this is no different. But I would say the majority of New Testament scholars solve the question of how Matthew, Mark, and Luke are related with this answer. And all it means is we pretty much all agree that Mark is the first gospel, the oldest gospel, written around the year 70, maybe 69, 70. And Mark is a biography of Jesus. If you wanted to make a graphic novel of any of the gospels, pick Mark. It's an action gospel. It's miracles, it's travels, it's exorcisms, healings. It's all action, and it's the adult life of Jesus. Then you get Matthew and Luke, and they have taken Mark and they have used Mark as their base. But what they both have in common that's new is a whole bunch of Jesus sayings. And they have them usually pretty verbally identical in Greek, which if they were remembering them, if they were passed down orally, Jesus spoke Aramaic. So the fact that Matthew and Luke have Jesus sayings in Greek kind of identically means that probably someone before Matthew and Luke translated them into Greek and set them down. Another reason why we think Matthew and Luke had access to an early list of Jesus' sayings is that they get inserted into Matthew and Luke in pretty much the same order. Even though Matthew and Luke don't do the same things with them, they might give them a different meaning. They might put them in a different town. They're all mix and match in terms of what context the sayings get plugged into, but they generally have the same wording and appear in the same order. And this has given rise to a number of hypotheses over the years, but the one that seems to have stayed the steadiest and remained the consensus or the most popular answer to this question is the Q hypothesis. So that there was an early somebody, some group, shortly after Jesus' death, set into writing in Greek everything he said, what they could remember that he said. And so this we call Q. Can you read Q? You can. You can read it. Scholars read it in the critical edition, which is a bunch of columns in, well, it's not very pleasant to read, but it's the way to see how the scholars have reconstructed it. Or you can read it in accessible English translation. There are many of them. One of them, an inexpensive one, is Q, the Earliest Gospel by John Kloppenberg, or you can read it for free online at earlychristianwritings.com. When I ask my students to pretend they don't know anything about Jesus, they've never heard of Jesus, they know nothing, but I give them Q to read, just Jesus' sort of agreed upon early layer of sayings. And I ask them to tell me how they would describe Jesus if they didn't know anything except these teachings. And when they come back to me, they almost always say, he's Jewish. That's obvious because he's quoting Jewish scripture and talking about Torah and etc., really passionate about temple and Torah and Jewish scripture. But the other thing they all say is he's angry, he's cranky, he's upset about something. He's not necessarily that nice, he's prickly. So this is what they notice. So that tells you right away that maybe we're onto something when we separate out this material that is thought to go back to really close to ground zero of the Jesus movement. We see that the gospel writers, in their desire to make Jesus palatable, they've softened some of the anger. They've tamed Jesus a little bit. They've airbrushed Jesus. But when you look at what he went around saying, it was pretty volatile, passionate, and this stuff. But there's something else that I noticed in addition to this anger when I looked at the Q sayings, and it was something called gendered pairs. Jesus had a habit of teaching in twos, and the twos were sort of a binary gender. So what am I talking about? Jesus would teach the same didactic piece, the same parable, the same story twice, two different ways. One with a masculine example and one with a feminine example. One with a male protagonist, one with a female protagonist. One with a task that men typically did at the time. One with a task that women typically did at the time. And these teachings are radically parallel, even identical, except the variable of gender. That's the variable in the sayings. And so I'm going to show you what I mean by that by going through some of them, or all of the ones in Q with you. Here's one of them: the widows and the lepers. It's two stories that Jesus tells back to back. There were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, when there came a great famine over all the land. And Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. Same story again. And there were many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed, but only Naaman the Syrian. So here's a parallel lesson. They both of them hark back to the Hebrew Bible, to the days of Israel. Both of them hark back to a Hebrew prophet, one to Elijah, one to Elisha. Both of them hark back to a problem, famine, leprosy, and both of them say that the prophet only helped one person, and that person was a foreigner. In the case of Elijah, we have a female example, Zarephath, the widow. In the case of Elisha, we have a male example, Naaman the Syrian. Here's another one: the persistent neighbor and the persistent widow. Two stories by Jesus, one with a male example, one with a female example. In the persistent neighbor, Jesus said, "Which of you has a friend who will go to you at midnight and say, 'Friend, lend me 3 loaves, for a friend of mine has arrived on a journey and I have nothing to set before him?' And he'll answer from within, 'Don't bother me. The door is shut. My children are with me in bed. I can't get up and give you anything.' I tell you, though he will not get up and give him anything because he's his friend, yet because of his importunity, he will rise and give him whatever he needs." So in this case, a male friend, a male neighbor needs something, and he persists, and finally he gets it. Not because the person he needed it from was nice, but because they were annoyed. Second example, Jesus said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow. It's feminine. This is a woman who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God or respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by continually coming. So once again, two stories, same lesson. The lesson is persist for bread, persist for justice. And even if the people are nice, they will have to help you because they're annoyed, basically. The female example is the widow. The male example is the male neighbor. Here's another. The queen of the south and the Ninevite men. They're short. They're quite parallel. And one is the queen and one is the Ninevite men. The queen of the south will be raised at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. The first one starts. Second one starts. Ninevite men will arise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. So parallel beginning. The parallel beginnings both hark back to foreign characters from the Hebrew Bible. One, a queen, and one, a group of men. And both of these characters from Israel's past, who are foreigners, are going to fare better on the day of judgment than this generation that's around Jesus. So Jesus is condemning his own generation. They're not doing something right. Look at these foreigners from the past. They're doing better than you, and they're not even Jewish. So the queen of the south and the Ninevite men. And why? Well, she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon. And look, something greater than Solomon is here. And the Ninevite men repented at the announcement of Jonah. And look, something more than Jonah is here. So in both cases, it's a guilt trip for the present generation around Jesus. And he's saying these foreigners are going to do better than you on the day of the Lord, on the judgment, because they listened. But female example and male example. The pair of stories about the mustard seed and the yeast. Jesus is musing, what is the basileia, or the reign, the rule, the empire, the kingdom of God like? And with what am I to compare it? Comparison number one, it is like a seed of mustard, which a man took and threw into his garden, and it grew and developed into a tree, and the birds of the sky nested in its branches. And again, he says, with what am I to compare the basileia of God? It is like yeast, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour until it was fully leavened. So it's two similes. Jesus is looking for something with which to compare the reign of God, the rule of God. And he comes up with a mustard seed that's planted by a man, and yeast that's planted by a woman. And they're both tiny things that then work and grow into something much bigger. Many of you have probably heard all of these before, but never noticed that they were pairs with male-female examples. But if you put on the glasses of thinking about gender when you look at ancient texts, things rise to the surface that you didn't notice before. Here's another one. The man loses a sheep, a woman loses a coin. Which of you, Jesus says, having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, will not leave the 99 and go after the one which was lost until he finds it? Just so, I tell you, in heaven he rejoices over it more than over the 99. So here you have a shepherd, a typically male profession at the time. He has a lot of sheep. He only loses one of them, but he values that one, and he leaves the 99 to go bring that one back, and everyone's happy over the lost one more than over the 99 that stuck around. Female example, what woman who has 10 coins, if she were to lose one coin, would not light a lamp and sweep the house and hunt until she finds, and on finding, she calls the friends and neighbors, saying, rejoice with me, for I found the coin which I had lost. Just so, I tell you, there's joy before the angels over one repenting sinner. So both of these little stories teach the same lesson, which is how much more valuable it is to have someone come back, or something come back that was lost, than how much more emotionally valuable and reason to rejoice than things that were just like there all along being fine. But he bothers to tell the story 2 different ways, presumably so that among his audience members, some of whom were men and some of whom were women, everyone would be able to see and relate. And by the way, the fact that shepherding is typically a masculine job at the time is echoed in the feminine parable, because typically managing the money of the house was the woman's job. So these are gendered not only in one's a man and one's a woman, but they're gendered in the tasks as well, based on stereotypes of the time. Here's a very short one, but it's an important one. 2 men will be in the field, one is taken and one is left. 2 women will be grinding grain at the mill, one is taken and one is left. This is an apocalyptic saying. In other words, it's a saying about the impending end of the world, the day of wrath, day of judgment, day of the Lord, an expectation for some Jews at the time, including Jesus. Many of Jesus' sayings are apocalyptic like this, and they talk about a judgment that's coming soon. And in this saying, he says, you might see 2 men standing there. Suddenly, one has a certain eschatological or spiritual judgment, and the other one has the different one. And the same thing happens with one of the women and one of the men. You might think, great, just another example, some men, some women. But drilling down, this tells us that in Jesus' mind, individual women, as well as individual men, were fully religious agents. They were human in their own right and responsible for their own sort of eschatological or divine outcome of judgment. So here, you can't get any clearer. Jesus is viewing women as religiously responsible for themselves, just like men. Now, here's one that most people don't notice as a gender pair, but I think this is one too. He says, which of you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a serpent? So the lesson is, I think the lesson is that praying to God, you should pray to God, because he's not gonna, it will never hurt. God's always gonna, you're never gonna have negative repercussions for praying, I think is one of the meanings. But how is this a gendered pair? The bread and the fish. Bread making was a typical woman's job at the time, and fishing was a typical men's job at the time. So even though there's no kind of male and female protagonist, I still think there's masculine task and a feminine task in this short little pair. And another one, I think this is the last one, the ravens and the lilies. Also, there's no people here except Solomon, but I still think these are gendered pairs. Consider the ravens, Jesus says. They neither sow nor reap nor store in barns, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? So it's a little lesson about trusting that your daily needs, like food and shelter and clothing, don't worry about them, just trust. And God's going to provide them and take care of you. Same story again. Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown in an oven, how much more will he clothe you? So it's 2 stories to try and reinforce the idea of having a childlike faith that God will take care of you. Using natural things as an example of, like, see, God even takes care of them and you're even more important than them. How are these gendered? It's in the tasks again. The ravens neither sow nor reap nor store in barns. That's a list of 3 tasks that would typically be done by men. I say typically because when people are extremely impoverished, gender roles tend to break down because it's all hands on deck. And The poorer you get in society, the more you have everyone helping with everything because it's desperate. But when things are going okay, typically it would be the men doing the planting, the reaping, and the storing in barns. The lilies, the tasks that they don't have to do, toiling and spinning. Spinning refers to making cloth in order to, like making yarn out of sheep's wool and spinning it into cloth in order to make clothes. This is very gendered, strongly feminine in this time period. In fact, underneath one of our early manuscripts for the New Testament, James Robinson has discovered that what it really said was actually another list of 3 tasks that the lilies didn't do. You know, the ravens don't sow, reap, or store in barns. Well, the lilies don't card, toil, or spin. Underneath the manuscript, it shows that at some point, a male scribe didn't actually know the Greek word card. He was like, what is this? Carding. It's such a feminine task that the scribe didn't even know the word. And so it got altered into a less parallel version of the saying that made it into the canon. But once again, I think this is another gendered pair. So I have this chart of a variety of examples of Jesus teaching in twos, one with a male example, one with a female example. And in my book, what I did was look at all the people who had looked at these and tried to make a comment on what it meant about Jesus' view of women. And I'll tell you that not many people have looked at this, because by and large, most of critical scholarship that looks at the early sayings material, they just care about the relationship, the synoptic problem, the relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and how they used each other. They just try to solve that problem and then they chuck it. It's only been recently that scholars such as Sara Rollins have said, okay, but if these sayings are from an earlier time in the early Christianity or the Jesus movement, why don't we analyze them for their social context? With whom would these sayings resonate? What kind of makeup of the audience will be attracted by these sayings? What kind of strategies, it's my question, what kind of strategies are present in Jesus' mind as a good teacher that we can see playing out? What was he trying to effect in the people around him? What in them will tell us why the people were compelled to follow him? Why was he so popular and beloved until now? So the people who have actually looked at this aspect are few, and the people who have then looked at it to tell us something about women are even fewer. But I sort of gathered them into 3 camps, the ones who have done this. Camp A, for example, Louise Chatroff, Denis Fricker, and Jean-Francois, maybe, Racine, are people who have looked at the gendered pairs and said, well, 100%, this means gender equality. Jesus was a gender egalitarian. Jesus was programmatically gender egalitarian. There was a discipleship of equals at ground zero around Jesus, and he wanted that. He wanted to say everyone's equal. Gender doesn't matter. Class doesn't matter. You know, no categories matter. It's just equality. And this was the driving reason for these pairs, because Jesus believed in gender equality. I am oversimplifying them. So don't not read them and think, oh, I know what they say. This is just oversimplified, but bear with me. So there's Camp A that says, wow, these gender pairs prove Jesus was a feminist. Then there's Camp B that has more nuance on that point. Alicia Batten and Kathleen Corley, who say, yeah, you look at these pairs, you see women being valued on the same level as men intellectually, like women are expected to absorb the same message and teaching. Women are expected to act, go out and respond the same way as men. Women are religious and intellectual equals in the mind of Jesus based on this rhetorical technique. Jesus was surrounded by men and women all the way down, lots of women around him, which the Gospels corroborate. But they say this is circumscribed because Jesus did not invent this notion that women and men were equals. Jesus was not the first Jewish guy to treat women as human beings. This was a trend at the time, beginning in the late Republic and moving into the early Roman Empire, after which we see a decline. There was a temporary blossoming for women. We see women initiating divorce. We see Jewish women queens. We see women financial patrons. We see women business owners, women as political activists, women philosophers. All kinds of options were open to Jewish and Greek and Roman women at the time of Jesus. So we can't jump. We can't jump to Jesus was a feminist and Jews weren't. So that's their kind of qualification. Like, yeah, these pairs show equality, but it's not as big a deal as feminist theologians are making it. Jesus was not a feminist for this. He was a product of his time and his Judaism. And then finally, Camp C has A.J. Levine and William Arnall, who say, you know what? What if these pairs don't mean equality in the first place? For Arnall, he's a specialist in scribality, scribal culture, scribal practice, and he noticed that Jewish scribes love variations on a theme. And so what if the gender pairs are simply scribes taking a story that Jesus said and then doing a variation on it because they are trained to do that. And it's a good practice for reinforcing a lesson with a different example. But what I said in my book to Arnall, and I believe he forgives me because he did a lovely review of the book, so he's not angry with me. What I said in the book was, yes, scribes do love variations on a theme, but the genre of Q is not really a legal document, and the variations on a theme don't seem to happen just throughout it in all kinds of ways. They really only happen with gender pairs. And so I think that means we have to take the gender part of the variation quite seriously, since it wasn't otherwise a trend in Q. A.J. Levine, on the other hand, takes a different tack, and she does so for an extremely good reason. She says, no, these don't mean gender equality, because look around in the wider context. There's lots of androcentric language coming from Jesus. Jesus chose 12 male disciples as the core kind of representative of the 12 tribes. There's all kinds of reasons why this movement is not gender egalitarian. So we can't make too much of these gendered sayings. And the reason why it's very important to A.J. Levine and in general to not make too much of a feminist Jesus is because 9 times out of 10, when Christian theologians want to lift up a feminist Jesus, they do it by throwing Judaism under the bus. They prop up Judaism as a negative foil. Oh, so patriarchal, so terrible for women at the time. But Jesus came along and he was a shining sparkle rainbow. And that's just not accurate. It's not accurate. The ancient world was patriarchal, yes. So is the modern world, but it's a spectrum. And at Jesus' time, within the Judaism before Jesus, there was a spectrum, some of which was horrible for women. just like every other group in the ancient world, was in some ways, in some groups, horrible for women. But on the other end of that, you have many examples of wonderful treatments of women in early Judaism, and various agency and roles and options for women in early Judaism. And Jesus, being gender egalitarian, isn't over and against Judaism. It comes out of him being Jewish. He was one of that type of Jew. So what I tried to do in the book was look at everyone who had commented on this and try to say, you know what? Everyone is right. I know they're all right. So how can they all be right together? And this is what I came up with. Camp A is right that there's equality in these sayings. The sayings definitely mean that Jesus had women around him and saw them as important, necessary, valuable, intelligent, spiritually key to the movement. And he didn't give them a different lesson from the men. He gave them the identical religious message as the men and expected them to respond and act and go out there and build the basileia like the men, with the men. So yes, Camp A is right. Jesus did show in his manner of teaching that he valued women and men equally. But Camp B is also right, that this doesn't mean Jesus, unlike other Jews, treated women with respect and human dignity and equality. Rather, there are other examples of this at the time. Jesus did innovate, in my opinion, this rhetorical technique. He did make up teaching with gender pairs, but it doesn't mean he was the very first Jew that was respectful to women. That's just not true. And that's why Camp C, especially Levine, is so important. Jesus being a person who treated men and women equally does not say anything negative about any Judaism. There was some patriarchal Judaism. There was some patriarchal, there were patriarchal Romans. There were patriarchal Greeks. There were nasty practices everywhere in the ancient world, but it's not a matter of Judaism nasty, Jesus great and sparkly. That's just inaccurate, inappropriate, unethical, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my conclusions in this book were, A, there were a lot of women around Jesus, and that's corroborated in the Gospels. We might think of Jesus going around with 12 guys, but if you look carefully between the lines, you see that at every step, that group is pretty big, and it is full of women that traveled with him, and it specifically identifies them as the financial benefactors. In other words, the women bankrolled this traveling around, and that's not something the gospel authors would be particularly proud to include, because they're not particularly friendly to women. This is another way that they kind of soften the gender pairs by inserting them in coatings. But there's no doubt that Jesus was surrounded by women who were his supporters, very important to the movement. Secondly, when Jesus taught, he deliberately crafted teaching so that the women and the men in his audience got the same lesson. This is not the early 2nd century, like 1 Timothy saying, men, love your wives. Women, obey your husbands. It's not a hierarchy. It's not a gendered hierarchy. It's strictly like the same message for everyone. And thirdly, Jesus innovated that rhetorical strategy. Nobody made these types of gendered pairs before him, although many did after him. So he deserves credit for being an inclusive teacher, having an inclusive classroom. His pedagogy was crafted to be inclusive so that everyone in the audience could kind of see, that's me in his story. I get it. The warnings or caveats that come out of this research is, one, Q's treatment of women, or Jesus' treatment of women in his teaching, shows that women were seen as intellectually, like cognitively equal to men, able to digest the same level of lesson, and religiously equal, called to do stuff in the movement, called to make changes inside their practice, their spiritual lives. Absolutely. But Jesus does not erase gender. He totally is comfortable using gendered stereotypes, and it's a binary. I mean, the very definition of binary is two. He's got the male, the female, the male, the female, and he participates in women do the monetary, the financial stuff in the household. They sweep the floor, they bake the bread. Men are the shepherds. They plant, they harvest, they fish. He doesn't say like, women, go be shepherds, and men, try sweeping. He totally plays into and uses the stereotypes in his teaching. So just because Jesus treated women as intellectually equal to men doesn't mean he was a 21st century feminist. Maybe it's valuable to theologians to say that because they want people to be treated equally today, but they can't claim that Jesus was kind of erasing gender in the same way that feminism does today. It's just not there. He used a binary and he used gender stereotypes. And secondly, Jesus did innovate this inclusive teaching technique, but he didn't do so over and against Judaism. He did it within Judaism. So it's not an excuse to paint Judaism with a terrible brush just to have a sparkly, perfect Jesus. That's not the way that works. And this book by Fredrickson and Reinhardt is a great place to start if you want to start unpicking how, if you happen to be a Christian, you can use the New Testament in ways that doesn't participate in anti-Semitism, basically. And I'm leaving you with some more resources, which I'll paste into the comments. Videos about why studying women in Q, why read the New Testament chronologically, discussions I've had with other scholars like James McGrath, Matt Baldwin, Shirley Paulson about women in the sayings of Jesus. And yeah, I'll stop there. This is what you will find if you read my book, Gender in the Rhetoric of Jesus, which I've tried to write very accessibly so anyone could enjoy it, not just scholars. But I will say that the press I chose is very expensive. So it's a bit, it's prohibitive. The cost is prohibitive. So I'm really sorry about that. You know, scholars we don't make money from our books. So when you see, don't judge me harshly if you see like, what, $100? Who can read this? I know. I don't make the money. So that's the way scholarly publishing works. It's too bad. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this talk about why, when we dig down to the earliest level of material that we think came from the mouth of Jesus, we do see gender equality, but maybe not 21st century style.